If you haven't been following Conversations with Chanda, please visit conversationswithchanda.org. If you're in the Minneapolis area, be sure to check out Conversations with Chanda live. Enjoy the show.
I had a professor at Howard who, unknown to me, he began to apply the pressure in class. He began to push me. Now, I have to admit that he was my professor. I really got more than upset. I experienced for the first time in my life the feeling of hate. And now it's toward a black man, and I'm in a black seminary. You can just imagine the internal tension that requires in my own growth. So I finally said, I just can't sit in this spell. I went to his office, and I asked for his forgiveness for feeling that way. And he said, "I've just been waiting for you to come." That made me mad again. I'm like, here I am, as it were, on my knees, asking for your forgiveness. But he could still sense that this work in me was not yet finished. He told me what he had been doing, and then he knew if I was really called to do the work of racial justice, this was simple, what I dealt with at seminary, then he needed to prepare me for when I went out.
I'm Chanda with Conversations with Chanda, part of the Minneapolis Foundation podcast. I am with Curtiss DeYoung, and I am just going to have you jump in and introduce yourself.
I'm Curtiss DeYoung. I'm the CEO of the Minnesota Council of Churches. I've been in this position for 2.5 years. The Minnesota Council of Churches represents primarily the Protestant churches in the state of Minnesota. It includes the Greek Orthodox Church, the historic African American denominations that are here, and what people call the mainline Protestant churches.
That's really awesome. So I was reading a little bit about your background, and so you were raised in Kazoo, in Kalamazoo.
Yes.
My son played football there briefly, and it's quite an interesting place. And so in one of your books, you describe being kind of in this community of people that wasn't very diverse?
Correct, yeah. So I was actually born in the northwest corner of Indiana, an area affectionately known as Amish country. Was not Amish, but my father was a pastor of a rural church, so very, very white. And then we moved to Michigan, and we lived in the one suburb that Kalamazoo had, called Portage, which was, when I was there, my graduating class of 400 students was 99% white. There were 3 black males in my class. So very Dutch, so it wasn't just white, it was a kind of whiteness, Dutch community, and that very much shaped the way I was raised.
Yeah, and you lived there your entire school?
Most of up through graduating high school.
Okay. And then I read that when you were about 12, you watched King, is it Montgomery to Memphis?
Yes.
And so that was your first introduction to Martin Luther King?
Yeah, so this was 2 years after his assassination that I watched that. I'm living in a northern white community. King was not a part of our conversation. I'm sure my parents knew who he was, but none of my schooling or anything. So we're sitting down, my father and I, one night watching public television, and on comes, from Montgomery to Memphis, 3 hours of news clips from the civil rights movement focused around the Martin Luther King story. And I was shocked by what I saw. As I reflect back on it now, I believe that as white people, we still know something's not right at some deep level, but at a conscious level, this was shocking to me, the segregation, the poverty. So what I did as a 12-year-old is I went to the store, bought every LP album of Dr. King preaching that I could find, every biography that I could find on King, and began reading and listening. And if you were one of my high school teachers and you assigned a paper, I wrote it on Martin Luther King.
Wow. Were your parents supportive of your newfound interest in Martin Luther King and the movement?
Yeah, they were not activists, but they were open-minded and committed, had relationships with a few black people here and there. And one of the things I noticed is that at that time period, when I was a couple years older, the issue was open housing. And so they had a sign in the front window committing themselves to open housing. But I don't think if we hadn't watched this show that I would have ever really had that conversation with my parents and seen that side until I was older, because they were sort of quiet.
You know, as an African-American person, we often kind of either talk about either like funny but not funny sort of way of like, you know, anytime you get educated in school, you hear about Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, and certainly there are a lot of African-American people that have contributed in great ways to this country. And so for me to think about you at that time period, 2 years out from his assassination, not knowing, what do you think that this is a common thing where people are isolated from history and specifically the history of the civil rights movement or people of color in this world in our United States?
Certainly it was true then. I think it's still possible to live an all-white life. You're in a white community, white friends, you go to a white church. We still hear about textbooks that are not inclusive. If they are, it's one paragraph or one page here and there, and it's often things like, well, we brought folks from the continent of Africa, and this was a good thing for them because they got civilized. I mean, just really horrible kinds of misinformation and falsehoods. So I think it's less possible now because popular culture is so diverse. But at the time, even the popular culture was very segregated when I was raised. Now, I'm in a suburb of Kalamazoo, Michigan, which Kalamazoo did have a black population, about 30%, I would think, if I remember right. It was, again, very segregated, and busing was happening at that time. So there was an awareness of tensions, but not an awareness of who the heroes were, who the people were working on issues of civil rights, at least in my upbringing.
Yeah, so you go from Kalamazoo and somehow end up at Howard.
Yes.
I mean, I know we've talked about this in the past, but you end up at Howard University, which is a historically black university. And can you just tell us what that decision-making process was like, or how you landed there?
Sure. So I went after high school. I did my college in Southern Indiana at a school related to my church denomination. And of all things, it was in an area that was the Ku Klux Klan was active, and David Duke was the Grand Dragon at the time that everyone was talking about, and he's made a comeback due to Black Klansmen and people knowing who he is. From there, I moved to New York City to work at a homeless shelter in Times Square, and that was a shock, very kind of diverse context. I was working in a Catholic organization and actually living in a Catholic faith community. Again, a real stretch as a Protestant, fairly conservative kid. And so one Sunday I said, I've got to find a church of my own denomination, so I have a few hours each week of feeling comfortable, because I was being stretched on the subways, at work, because we worked with mostly kids from Puerto Rican and African American communities. And so I go to church on Sunday. I didn't know my way around New York, and so I get on the A train going north in Manhattan, because I was going to stay in Manhattan for church, and got off at 145th and got on the local, which was then called the Double A train, went up to 155th. And anyone that's been to New York who's following the path knows I've now stepped out into the northern part of Harlem. I didn't know where I was because I didn't know my way around. Sunday morning, I walk into this church, says the church name of my denomination. Little did I know I was walking into a 100% African-American congregation. So surprising was it to the usher who welcomed me at the door that she said, "May I help you?" An unusual greeting at a church. I told her, I was this Church of God, right? It's a denomination. And then she welcomed me in. And then I should say, the pastor found out I was there and invited me, even before the service officially began. He invited me into his office to find out who I was and why are you here?
Why are you lost, son?
And found out I was planning to become a minister. And so took me under his wing, as happens in African-American church settings. They use an apprenticeship model of training, and apprenticed me for the year I was there. And so once a month on Sunday morning, I was taught to preach by the congregation. So that's what set me up for Howard. Not knowing yet that I was going to Howard, I decided to go to Union Theological Seminary in New York. I'd taken a year break and was planning to return to New York, and went to D.C. for the summer to do an internship at another black church in our denomination. And do I have to be honest?
Yeah.
Okay. I met the woman who's now my wife at the church.
Yep.
And so I said, there's got to be a seminary in D.C. because this is pre-cell phone, pre-email, distance relationships.
So it was a woman that brought you to Howard.
It was a woman, yeah. A matter of the heart.
Yes, and she is beautiful.
So I'm at a black church saying I need to find a seminary, and the pastors there, many were Howard University alum, so they took me over to Howard University Seminary. They didn't look at any other seminary. They took me to the seminary that they knew and loved, and met the dean. And he'd previously been a dean at the seminary in New York Union where I had applied. And so within the matter of a few minutes, I was enrolled and starting at Howard University.
So was your experience at Howard shocking in any way, or had you been on a journey that allowed for a level of comfort, or did you find yourself being challenged by your thinking and your comfort, or what was that experience like transitioning in there?
Well, I was the only white in the classroom most of the time. It's a D.C. In the mid-'80s when I was there. It was a very black city. So the difference, I would say, is that, I had an experience in New York, which was sort of a Wednesday evening, Sunday morning, very welcoming experience, and so I had become more comfortable, and a lot of the stereotypes I had been dispelled. But coming to Howard I was still welcomed, but this is an academic institution that is going to challenge and assess and analyze, and I learned to think critically at Howard. And so what it took was the experience, which could have easily just been a 1 year, now in my 60s, looking back fondly on that 1 year in Harlem, like people look back on youth camp or something.
Yeah, the 1 year they spent in Mexico or something.
Right. It could have been that. But what Howard did is it took that experience and analyzed it, assessed it, taught me about how race operates. And being the only white student often in the classroom, I heard very honest conversations about race, because a lot of times when we're in multiracial context, we all clean it up a little bit. We don't quite say everything that we want to say, but it was very blunt, very transparent, and I'm sure, I'm just one person there, and hopefully over time I was trusted, but I had the benefit of being able to hear that. The first semester, I will admit that I was quiet, because in most of my classes I was trying to figure out this new context, this new environment. The other amazing thing about Howard Divinity School in the mid-'80s was Jesse Jackson was running for president the first time. A lot of the civil rights icons are alumni of Howard, so they were walking the hallways. And so what I knew of the civil rights story was the Martin Luther King story. It was greatly expanded at Howard. In fact, I remember one day a gentleman walking the hallways with a patch over his eye, and I said, "Who is that?" And they go, "Who is that?" "That's James Farmer. He started the Freedom Rides. You should know who that is." And he was an alum of the school, just back visiting. So it was an amazing kind of environment and place to be.
Mm-hmm. And there's two things that I guess I'm thinking about. One is you've lived a life that, by all accounts, looks like you've kind of pushed the boundaries, that you've lived kind of on the edge of maybe comfort zones, and yet it feels like you found a place of belonging. And I'm trying to think about me as African American going into a school where I was the only person of color and wondering whether or not I would be able to find a place of belonging. And I don't really have a question or an answer to that. I have more questions than answers.
So yes, I did find a place of belonging. My comfort grew the longer I was there. But what you have just described are two very different contexts. As a white person, the minute I stepped off campus, I had all my privilege back in place. Probably still had much of it while I was there. Yes, I was a minority and one and only, but I wasn't experiencing racism, microaggressions, the kinds of things that people of color experience in white contexts. And it was important for me to figure that out pretty quickly, that the minute I stepped off campus, I had more privilege and opportunity perhaps even than my seminary dean as a white person. So to understand the difference, because I think that's another thing that happens to we as white people, we have these experiences, we're embraced, we're accepted in contexts of people of color, and we think it's the same. Yes, there are some similarities, but it's also very different.
Mm-hmm. The other is this idea of kind of deconstructing ideas and beliefs and stereotypes, and placing yourself with people who may have different thoughts, and some of those thoughts could even be polarizing, they could be offensive. And as we live in a time where people only want to sit with people they agree with, what is the importance actually of sitting with people that you don't agree with, or maybe you're actually offended by?
Well, it's...
is there any benefit?
I want to believe that there is. We all from the same human family, ultimately. As a person of faith, I say we're all created in the image of God. And the reality is that as we are in relationship with folks, or we're in places where even they're uncomfortable, we can begin to understand what has shaped folks to be a certain way. So, for instance, I had a professor at Howard who wanted to test me. And what's this? Is he just some sort of liberal white do-gooder here? So unknown to me, he began to apply the pressure in class. He began to push me. And what he wanted to know was, could I deal with an angry black male? Because he saw that some of my relationships had been with much more diplomatic African-American leaders. And because he said that you've got to be able to deal with the full range, and you got to understand that the anger is not just angry black male. It's an anger about how society has positioned black people, the kind of racism that African Americans are experiencing, the gaps that we talk so much about today. And he wanted to know if I could then still stay in the conversation. Now, I have to admit that he was my professor, and I was getting pushed, and so I really got more than upset. I experienced for the first time in my life the feeling of hate. And now it's toward a black man, and I'm in a black seminary. You can just imagine the internal tension that requires in my own growth. So I finally said, I just can't sit in this spot. I got to do with this. So I went to his office, and I asked for his forgiveness for feeling that way. And he said, I've just been waiting for you to come. That made me mad again. I'm like, here I am, as it were, on my knees asking for your forgiveness. But he could still sense that this work in me was not yet finished. And I'll say it's a lifetime journey to take on these kinds of issues and build these kind of relationships. But by the time I left, we had an exit interview when I left the school. And by then he told me what he had been doing. He told me that it was out of a deep sense of care and love for me, and that he knew if I was really called to do the work of racial justice, this was simple, what I dealt with at seminary, then he needed to prepare me for when I went out.
Mm-hmm. Was he right?
Yeah. So
I know you ended up in Chicago. I know I'm truncating your bio,
sure.
But you are formerly the executive director of the Community Renewal Society, which is a historic civil rights organization in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So that was located in a pretty diverse neighborhood?
So the community rural side worked citywide, but and it was a church-based community organizing policy advocacy group. The core of the churches that defined the agenda were on the west and south side of Chicago, which are the historic African American communities. And the season that I was there was the season of police accountability and Ferguson happening and such. So that was some of the kind of work we did. And just to add a little note, the professor at Howard, his name is Dr. Calvin Morris. And then he was my predecessor in Chicago at the Community Renewal Society. Of all things, it came full circle. He was a former staff member in the last couple of years of Dr. King's work, and as King had located in Chicago for a while, he had joined the staff, and then with Jesse Jackson and some others created what was then called Operation Push, Rainbow Push. So he was quite an iconic figure. But it's amazing in my storyline that here's the professor that had taken me on in seminary. Now I'm called to replace him as executive director of an organization.
Incredible. So when you get there, the organization was focused on racial and economic justice, but it wasn't very diverse.
So Chicago, to help folks in the Twin Cities who are listening, Chicago is 2/3 persons of color. And while there are other cultural and racial groups, it breaks out pretty closely as 1/3 African American, 1/3 Latinx, 1/3 white. And so that affects everything that goes on in Chicago. Here's an organization that has been working on racial justice. It was a long-term, it was kind of we call a faith-based legacy, kind of a faith-based urban league. So it's a legacy organization, and King actually partnered with them when he was there in the late 60s, and that's what sort of shifted the organization toward becoming a racial justice organization. But the challenge was that in this entire time, and my two predecessors were both African American, 25 years of black executive leadership, the board had always been majority white. And the staff had not always been the case, but by the time I arrived, because there had been an interim period, the staff had become majority white. And now here I am coming from Minnesota, unknown, coming from an even whiter state, to be the head of an organization that has an integrity problem around who it is as it does work for racial justice. So that was problematic.
Mm-hmm. An integrity problem. So there's an integrity problem across a lot of the social sector, if you frame it that way, and that we know that despite much effort that boards have not become more diverse and leadership at the top levels have not become more diverse. Why do you think that that's an integrity issue?
So I'll start with the organization Chicago, but I'll bring it here. 25 years of black leadership, and the board is still majority white. So I began to think about how does power work in a nonprofit organization? Who's really the owner? It's the board. So even while you have black leadership at the executive level, which should be the case, you have a board. It's still submitting to a white dominant board. And so that means the board is, in many ways, really out of touch. I discovered that they were not even having conversations about racism at the board level, let alone this is a racial justice organization. I mean, that's a problem. So just before I signed on the dotted line to move to Chicago, I discovered the demographics of the board and said, I won't come unless you agree to become consistent with the demographics of Chicago, 2/3 persons of color. And they agreed. And so within a year and a half, the board had become majority African American. By the time I left, it was 75% persons of color, 2/3 black, and that because that was where our base primarily was. That completely changed the conversation in the organization. So then addressing staffing diversity that also aligned happened as well. And then we did strategic planning and decided we needed a black ED. And so I lost my job or worked my way out of a job is probably a nicer way to put it. But I knew that's what needed to happen. And so all that to say is that, and this is what really brought me to this realization was the young activists in Ferguson and around the country, the Black Lives Matter activists, because integrity is a huge issue for them. You know, you've got to be what you are doing. And so for legacy organizations who have kind of done it this way for so long and somewhat of a patronizing feel, I suppose, that's sort of a wake-up call. And because we were doing community organizing, we were interacting all the time with young Black Lives Matter style activists in Chicago who just looked at us and said, "You're not real. You're not, look at your organization. You're not really doing racial justice work." And so I think that the challenge for us here in the Twin Cities is that there's a huge move toward foundations, particularly. I'm on the board of the United Way, so I'll also add the United Way in there too. Saying to the organizations that they fund, you need to have diverse boards, you need to have people of color in leadership, and I agree with all of that. I think that's all needs to happen. But if you're saying it, I want to look back and look at your board and your staff and see the same thing, to see that you really are committed to this, that because these are the organizations that you're serving through your dollars, you should look like them. I understand that foundation boards also have to connect to white money and white power and all that, which, by the way, is not where all the power and all the money is all the time. But so I understand you're going to have members of your board that are connected to wealth. But I want to see that same kind of journey, that same kind of commitment that your board's doing IDIs as well as your staff. That to me, that's integrity in the work.
And there's nonprofits that will say, well, that's the same dynamics exist, which is why our board is all white, because we need to connect to power and money and resources, and that they can't find people of color that bring those things to the table.
I haven't looked hard enough.
I haven't looked hard enough. I don't know them.
They're there though.
Maybe we should start an apprenticeship program or whatever the things are. And so what do you say to those people that say they can't find them?
I say those people are there. They can be found. All I want to see at this stage is that you on a journey move in that direction. That's not going to happen overnight. Going to build a relationship. It's more challenging in the Twin Cities than it would have been for me in Chicago, given the demographics. But there's a huge black professional community here, dispersed in some ways, but can be found. Go to your church, Chanda. You'll find some folks.
Right. So, okay, so let's, you were on a board that was about racial justice. They weren't talking about race, and there's other organizations that we know are doing the same thing. But they are talking about disparities, and in some people's mind, talking about disparities is talking about race and racism.
They're connected clearly, and talking about them is an important first step. But again, I'm looking at your board and saying there's some disparities right on your board that can be fixed. And so I think it can be done. I just don't. I just think that our walk and our talk have to line up.
And do you think really like disparities is a starting point, or do you think racism is the reason for disparities?
Oh yeah, disparities is an outcome from racism.
Okay.
the start. It doesn't create racism.
Yeah.
Right. Which is like we after Charlottesville, the African American bishops on the board at the Council of Churches were sort of re-traumatized and struggling with that, and they said we want to meet with our white counterparts, and so we had an off-the-record meeting at Shiloh Temple on the north side, and most of the white bishops showed up and had this amazing conversation. But at one point, the white bishops had a chance to share after they'd listened for a while, and they talked about, we're doing all this work on white privilege. Mm. And the African-American bishops replied, isn't that wonderful? You've got the privilege to talk about white privilege. What we want to talk is about white supremacy. Mm. So it's the same kind of thing. It's the structures. And so, yes, racism creates disparities. Disparities don't create racism. And it's the same way. White supremacy creates white privilege. If you want to get to the core, yes, talk about privilege, understand how it operates, understand that you have it, but look at the core of what needs to be addressed to actually change it.
Mm-hmm. When, so it feels like now we're at a time where we're seeing so much racism, and it's so pronounced that I think it's in some ways becoming, it feels like more challenging to just be in any space without noticing the microaggressions. You can't be in social media, you can't watch the television, you can't really be in politics or anything. And I don't know, probably in one of your books you talked about kind of struggling with the evidence of hope. And I think that there are people, and I may or may not be one of them, that say, will we get through these times, right? Like they just feel like they keep coming louder and louder and louder. And perhaps we're at a tipping point, I don't know. And then you backed it up and said, well, in some ways there's a privilege of being able to have hope. And then I started thinking about, I don't know, Harriet Tubman, because I just saw the movie, and saying like that, there's been hope in communities that have had great despair for a long time. But how do you think through something like hope and faith and justice?
Yeah, in the Bible it talks about hope is the things you haven't seen.
The evidence of things unseen, yeah.
Yep. And so hope for me is difficult to sustain without faith. But I think for us in this particular time is that with the election of Barack Obama, hope just soared. That we had actually moved into a new time. And we hadn't. I mean, we had elected one black president who served us well, but that was just a beginning. And then we had this tidal wave response. Even before he was elected, it had begun, and now it's culminated into the current situation that we're in. And part of it was, and that's the thing, is that hope has to be an informed hope. So we can't just not see what's there. And this has allowed us to see what was already there. The kind of engagement of white nationalists now in the electoral process. They were there, they just got invited back into the electoral process. So a lot of those challenges there, but at the same time, quietly, demographic change in our country is continuing. And whites are going to drop below 50%, and power will follow some later because the demographics will change first. But there are the trends that tell us we're still moving, despite all of the attempts to slow it down or stop it. And so for me, the sort of the famous Martin Luther King quote, "The arc of moral history bends toward justice," I still believe is true. In fact, I have to believe it's true. And that's part of what faith and hope are, is that I have to believe. And that's where the movie Harriet becomes so inspiring. I saw it recently as well. And her determination to continue to fight on is startling in some ways.
It was. Desmond Tutu wrote the foreword in your book, Radical Reconciliation. How did that happen?
My co-author, Alan Busak, is also one of the heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle, one of the faith leaders. And in the season when Nelson Mandela and his generation of leaders were in prison and many others were in exile, the folks that are on the streets were Desmond Tutu and Alan Busak and the leadership there. And so Desmond Tutu is like a father to Alan Busak. So that's how that happened. I've had the opportunity to meet Archbishop Tutu on a few occasions, but picking a good co-writer helped that happen.
That's awesome. What is radical reconciliation?
Yeah, we chose the word because we were both concerned, both in South Africa and in here, that things were being called reconciliation that really were not reconciliation, or that the language had been co-opted or adapted in South Africa in many ways by the political system, and in our case by sort of a more conservative element. But we use radical in the original use of the word that it means getting to the roots. So the idea is radical reconciliation is to get to the roots of injustice, the things that create a need for reconciliation. So if we can get to the roots of racism or sexism, classism, and many other isms, if we can get to the roots of that and address the roots, then reconciliation follows. As both of us being biblical scholars, we looked at the first century church, which was under the domination of a colonial system, the Roman colonial system. And so when they were using the language of reconciliation, as the scholars would say today, they were giving it a post-colonial meaning. They were giving it a meaning that says, what does this mean in the context of colonialism? So it really is, biblical reconciliation is a pro-justice kind of term.
You have a book that you shared with me, Living Faith, How Faith Inspires Social Justice, where you lay out, I think it's 12 social justice leaders.
There's several in the book. Yeah.
There's several in the book. And then you ask a question in there, and I wrote it down, but I can't see it. I guess the question is that will we have leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and others that you have mentioned and that someone will be writing about in the 21st century? Like, does leadership organize different now? Or I think that's a question you asked in there. If it wasn't, it was something I thought.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed across, because I studied the 20th century for this book, is that especially sort of faith-inspired social justice leaders, we saw this move from them mostly being from the dominant culture, even a Gandhi is sort of, dominant Hindu culture, moving then to persons of color or people that are struggling, but mostly still male. And then by the end of the 20th century, we see women emerging, but often still sort of either the child of a man who was a protest activist, or somehow mentored by men in a sense. Yeah. But that's all changed now. So a few things I think that have changed in this current generation is that that women are at the forefront. If you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at immigration activists across the board, Native American activists. It's just a host of women, which is very encouraging. Second, leadership is not a singular person. It's not like we need to find Moses and follow. It's a shared, and I think that's healthier too. In the 60s, Martin Luther King's model was one that was very based on sort of a preacher model, with the preachers being at the lead. But at the same time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had a much more egalitarian model, although it was mostly male. But so they said, if our leader gets killed, we have another leader ready to step up. So it was very fluid. And I think that's where leadership is. And in fact, I know when the press would go to Ferguson to try to figure out who the leader was to interview, well, they're all leaders. Now that has its challenges as well, because of the diversity of perspectives and styles, but I think it is a healthier way of doing leadership. So yeah, we probably are not looking for that singular Moses-type leader. Doesn't mean there may not be some that emerge, but we can't count on that to build a just future.
Interesting. For the Ferguson and the protests and what came out of that, I know you've been doing work on philanthropy's role in countering hate. Mm-hmm. Did that work, was it birthed out of that, or where did the notion of philanthropy's role in that come from?
For us, it's very much a Minnesota conversation. So we've, for 15 years, had a partnership, the Council of Churches with Muslim American Society. And during Ramadan, we've hosted iftar meals where our job as Council of Churches to get folks who've never been in a mosque or have never met a Muslim, many of them Christians, some Jews, other folks, in during the month of Ramadan, because mosques are very much welcoming people in to break the fast with them. And so we usually have 1,000+ people each year that partake in that. So that's a 15-year partnership. But in the last few years, there's been quite a rise in hate here in Minnesota. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism. A lot of it's been directed toward houses of worship or people of faith, and it's being perpetrated often by people who call themselves Christians. So out of that sort of frustration and how do we address this and how do we find the resources to address this, Imam Assad and I, as we talk about it, how do we engage the philanthropic community? One is they're already sort of hesitant about funding religious-based organizations for legitimate reasons. And how do we then sort of focus that? And so, we began to have conversations and have had a wonderful number of conversations, some events where we've been able to share what's going on, and then tell folks in philanthropy, talk to each other, figure this out, but know that we can do some work, some partnership. And there's a number of, not just the two of us, obviously, there's a number of organizations now that are really kind of on the front lines of this work. And one of the real challenges is now how to take some of this work into rural Minnesota, and because that's where a lot of this is emerging. And the most amazing thing is that some of the worst cases of Islamophobia are happening in towns where there are no Muslims. Mm-hmm. And these Islamophobic preachers, as it were, are going through these towns, scaring people, giving them a lot of misinformation. And we know that particularly Somalis are moving around the state. And so they're getting set up for a horrible kind of response when they move in with this. So we just felt that the philanthropy community could be a great partner. And we also thought, weave this into the things that you're already doing as well. If your focus is youth, if your focus is affordable housing, look and see, are there elements within that you can do this kind of work as well. Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, it was kind of a call out.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think we need ways to hold each other accountable. In your best imagined mind about where this could go and how philanthropy would lead in, is it as you just described, that it would be woven in and embedded? Would it be that that we would bring voice to these issues along with resources? I mean, what is your ultimate hope, I guess, for where this could lead?
All of that. I mean, I think that there are certain things that philanthropy can do that we can't do. And certainly in the kind of giving voice, amplifying what's already going on, certainly important. A lot of the organizations on the front lines of this work need greater capacity to do it. So it's sort of investments in building capacity. And then it's together sort of trying to create a vision and a framework. One of the things that Muslim American Society and Minnesota Council of Churches are sort of talking together, because we're both, we're in the church, they're in the mosque, and we're trying to figure out how you bring congregations together so that what we've been doing in Ramadan is a year-round sort of occurrence that people are building relationships. Because we found one of the most, as simple as it is, but one of the most successful ways to defeat this kind of hate, because so much of it's out of ignorance and fear, is to actually build relationships. And people actually know a Muslim or a few Muslims and have actually built relationships that radically changes. And we've seen that happen at Dar al-Farouk in Bloomington, which is one of the mosques that we work with, where now there's 4 or 5 churches that are working in partnership with them, and people know each other and connect, and there's still hate coming toward the mosque, but they've now got a set of partners. And so often on Friday prayers, there's a bunch of Christians out there walking the sidewalks and making sure that it's safe for people to come to worship.
Safe to come to worship.
Yeah.
When one of the speakers that I know that you're in contact with that's going to come and bring awareness is Reverend Sekou. And I have not had the pleasure of meeting him, but he will be on the podcast upcoming. Good. He seems like quite a dynamic person.
He is.
And he's been going around the country workshopping for faith leaders.
So Reverend Sekou is originally from St. Louis, and so when Ferguson broke out, he returned home. And one of the things that he's very effective at is doing the training for nonviolent disobedience. So he does a lot of those kinds. So he trained most of the folks in Ferguson. And he then was a part of the strategy team and developed a plan for the faith-based resistance to what happened in Charlottesville. So those are kind of two key points. But he's been doing this through the years. And he was arrested in Ferguson and went on trial to be sort of that public test case. He's a brilliant strategizer. He's a brilliant theologian. He's also a musician. I mean, he's just can't confine him or define him. Yeah, right. So, but yeah, so we're eager to have him here in the Twin Cities and learn from him, and see how we can continue to build those kind of connections.
Really cool. And as we close, when I think about the faith community here, and I've been in a number of conversations where you see churches wrestling or thinking through what are ways that they can operate outside of the church doors, and they say, like, we need to get in a community more. And for some churches, they've been in that discussion for quite a long time. Any advice for them?
Don't be alone. Do it in partnership. There are folks like the Stair Step folks and ministerial alliances where you can do this together. I think what's happening also is that a lot of young people are not engaged in organized religion, whichever religion it might be, and so we have to be creative in the ways that we connect with young people. I was just talking to Reverend Billy Russell from Greater Friendship, who's also the chair of our board right now, and they did a concert choir. They put together an album of, I guess you say CD album.
Yep.
Young people, 150 young people, and at least a third of those folks had never been in a church. If they came and they sang gospel music and they experienced church, and one of the young people said, "I'm accepted for who I am." And that's the key. We got to accept people for who they are. And no matter who they are in our neighborhoods, communities, whether you're in Edina or you're in a community in the rural areas or wherever, the church and faith institutions still need to play the central roles that they were called to do.
And since you did a call out on philanthropy and our integrity, do you think the church has an integrity issue in terms of its purpose and its actions? Do you think that there's a misalignment?
Yes. So the same challenges that I had to address in Chicago, I had to address when I came to Minnesota Council Churches. It was mostly a white organization, well, all white initially. Now the 4 historic African-American denominations that are here in Minnesota are members. But yeah, we had a white board, mostly white staff, and so that's part of the reason why I took the job on, because I thought what I learned in Chicago, we could hopefully try to do that work here. And so within our structure, we've empowered African Americans into all our leadership positions. We're steadily diversifying our staff, which means you have to look at the org chart and notice that at the top of the org chart it gets a lot wider. You got to address all levels, and all that's intentional. It's effort. It's kind of recruiting you do. But what's interesting is I assumed I'd get pushback from this. From some of the predominantly white denominations. But what I've discovered is that the white denominations are aware that they have challenges when it comes to issues around diversity and equity. And so they're happy for us to try to experiment and try some things that they might be able to learn from and move forward on. And so... But yeah, there's definite, and that's one of the reasons. There's a few reasons why young people are not going to church these days, but one of them is they read the Bible, and it seems like churches were really diverse in the Bible, and then they look at churches today and they don't see that. So, and then it gets you again, are these churches working around social justice issues? Are these churches welcoming to whoever comes to their door? I mean, these are kind of things that now have kept a younger generation away from organized religion. So yeah, we have to work on our own integrity issue. So
Good deal. So as we close, is there anything that you would like to share that I haven't asked?
Oh, I think you've been pretty thorough. But I do want to say thank you, and I strong supporter of the Minneapolis Foundation and the kind of creative work you're trying to do here, and particularly the work about criminal justice and the reform and hopefully transformation that really needs to happen. So.
Perfect. I guess I have one last question that
Okay.
we can cut in. And I know you've got, because I'm going to ask you what books you might want to recommend. And so for our listeners that want to think more and study more about the issues that we talked about today, do you have any recommendations for books or resources that you'd like to share?
Sure. Well, we both agree go see Harriet.
Yep, we sure do. And Just Mercy.
Yep, Just Mercy. And then I like to listen to The Daily, and they just did the 1619 series of podcasts, which is a powerful look at the history and the lingering effects of that history around race. The book that really helped me, but it's probably a more of an academic geek kind of book, but it's called Looking for Lorraine. And it's an autobiography on Lorraine Hansberry. And when I was in Chicago, the apartment that I lived in was, I found out later after I'd already moved in, but it was called the Hansberry Building because her father had bought that as a part of the challenging the redlining and breaking the system in Chicago. And so Lorraine Hansberry, Raisin in the Sun is what she's best known for. And lived a short life. But she had this creative partnership with James Baldwin and Nina Simone. And I'm always fascinated because I think in this work, the way we kind of have the vision and create new ideas is we have to sort of cross-pollinate in a whole lot of different ways. And that just fascinated me. And with W.E.B. Du Bois as a mentor, I mean, it just like, wow, that was something. But there's a new book coming out. It's just out, I should say. It's on my shelf. I haven't read it yet. That looks at James Baldwin and William Buckley, who was sort of the conservative commentator that time, and they do a debate. And it's this amazing, sort of looks at the historic moment, but then reflects it back to today in discussions on race called The Fire is Upon Us by Nicola Buccola. So that's the next thing that's on my shelf to read.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To listen to more episodes and learn about upcoming events, please visit conversationswithchanda.org. You can follow Chanda on Twitter at Chanda S. Baker. This is Supak Kinitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Chanda.